Good morning or afternoon, everyone. As I believe people are aware, we're running a series of webinars to share information on the guidance that has been provided by the Ad Hoc Technical Group on Indicators to SAPSTA on the implementation of the monitoring framework. Many of the webinars that we've been doing have been on specific indicators. Today we're going to be looking at the capacity needs across the monitoring framework and its implementation. In order to do this capacity assessment, we issued a survey jointly with UNEP WCMC. There was a survey sent to all parties through a notification where parties were invited to send their capacity needs and their views on where they needed capacity for each indicator or each headline indicator in the monitoring framework for the Global Biodiversity Framework. And so today we're going to be sharing the results of that survey and providing some thoughts on what the survey says in terms of where we need to go with our capacity building efforts. So I'll introduce my colleagues today. Online we have Roberto Correo from UNEP WCMC. He's been the person who's supported the ATAG through really leading the data analysis of the survey results. And then Natasha Ali is also online, who's been coordinating this technical support that UNEP WCMC provided. Well, she's been coordinating the technical support across the whole work of the ATAG, but also on this survey. So over to you, Roberto.
Brilliant. I'll just quickly share my screen. Just checking, can I get confirmation everyone can see that?
Yep.
Brilliant. Excellent. So yes, good morning, afternoon or evening. Thank you for joining us today. As was briefly mentioned, I'm Roberto Correa, Program Officer in UNEP WCMC's Nature Indicators Focal Initiative. And today I will be presenting the capacity needs of parties with respect to the headline indicators of the monitoring framework of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, henceforth referred to as the GBF. To provide a sort of bit of background context and setting the scene, at the 15th meeting, the Conference of Parties adopted the GBF, and it sets out an ambitious sort of pathway to reach the global vision of world living in harmony with nature by 2050. Among the framework's key elements are 4 goals for 2050 and 23 targets for 2030. To monitor the implementation of the GBF, parties also adopted the monitoring framework in Decision 15/5. The monitoring framework itself is comprised of 4 types of indicators. These are the headline indicators, which are a set of high-level indicators that aim to capture the overall scope of the goal or target. In total, there are 26 headline indicators in the framework, spread across the 4 goals and 15 of the 23 targets. Now, headline indicators use methodologies agreed by parties and are calculated at the national level based on national data from national monitoring networks and national sources. There are then the binary indicators. These are derived from a set of questions answered by party focal points, and they are aimed at understanding the progress made towards implementing measures to deliver on the ambition of the framework itself. Finally, there are component and complementary indicators. These indicators are optional for reporting purposes, and their intention is to capture the additional aspects of the elements in the goals and targets that are not necessarily captured by the headline or binary indicators. Now, as was previously mentioned, the indicators adopted in the monitoring framework were at various sort of levels of readiness, and that is the purpose of this questionnaire was that UNEP WCMC prepared to support the ATAG with a collaboration with the Secretariat, is to assess the headline indicators specifically, since these are the ones that parties have to report on. Furthermore, for the reporting purposes, given that there are only 26, we thought it'd be most accessible for parties to reply to. Binary indicators, even though they are required for national reporting purposes, were still being under review and thus were not included in these sort of results. As was mentioned, the survey was distributed to parties through a CBD notification in early February, and it ran up until sort of mid-April. The survey was available in English, French, and Spanish. A total of 44 parties responded to the survey. And this is 25% were sort of from the Africa region, 27% from the Americas, 18% Asia, 25% Europe, and 5% Oceania. So whilst somewhat geographically representative, it is still comprised of a relatively small sample of countries. So we would advise that the findings in this regard should be seen as an indication of the main needs, gaps, and priorities identified by parties. We also wanted to explore the differences amongst parties, particularly developing countries as opposed to not. And to do that, we also categorized the results according to whether or not a party was eligible for official development assistance. And those include countries that are low and middle income based on the gross national income per capita, as published by the World Bank, as well as those that are considered least developed countries as defined by the United Nations. In total, 29 of the 44 responses, in other words, 66%, were eligible to receive official development assistance. As I said, the indicators are a varying level of development, and the table here summarizes development status of headline indicators, in this case associated with targets on reducing threats to biodiversity. In the first column, we have the label associated with the headline indicator. For reference, this will be used in all subsequent figures. We then have sort of the name of the indicator, the goal and target associated with it, and the development status. Now, this work was conducted by the ARTIG in their third meeting, and essentially they were given indicators of rank from 1 to 5, 1 indicating that no methods are developed and a process needs to be established to development, all the way up to 5, in which case methods are established, data is being compiled, and indicators operational in most countries. For simplicity's sake, we basically disaggregated between 1 and 2. These are indicators that did not have an established methodology at the time of the survey, and then indicators 3 to 5, they did have an established methodology, and the figures will be presented in that subsequently. Then, if we look at the development status of headline indicators associated with targets on meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, we notice that whilst some of them do have an established methodology, a large majority also do not have. And then finally, the remaining headline indicators, these are the ones associated with targets on tools and solutions for the implementation and mainstreaming. I'd like to note that, yes, only 2 of them did have a development status, since the other ones were being reviewed by the Technical Expert Group on Financial Reporting. However, since the time of the survey, indicators D1, D2, and 18.1 were considered to have an established methodology, whilst D3 and 18.2 did not. Now, going to the survey itself, to help understand how the survey was conducted, in blue we have the questions, and then in grey we have the options parties were provided. And orange will provide sort of the skip function employed for this questionnaire. This will become more apparent as we delve in. But for each headline indicator, the first question that was asked to parties was, is there a national institution with a responsibility for reporting on this indicator? And what we find here is on the x-axis, I have listed all the headline indicators. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of respondents. And then on top of that, each individual number indicates the number of parties that reported. You might notice quickly in those numbers that 44 was a total number of responses received, but some indicators, for example, B1 only has 39. And that is because these questions were optional in the questionnaire as to avoid the reporting burden to parties, given that the metadata available for those indicators was not yet as developed. But what we see is that on average, 53% of parties consider that there is a national institution in country responsible for reporting on a given headline indicators. And on average, parties are more aware for those of indicators that have an established methodology with an average of 63% compared to those indicators that do not have an established methodology. In other words, only 43%. This is not too unsurprising, as when we look at the results, we notice, for example, headline indicator 3.1, coverage of protected areas and OECMs, has the highest one. Also, we have indicators 10.1 and 10.2 to do with proportion of agriculture area under sustainable use, and then progress towards sustainable forest management, and 8.3, so red list index. These are indicators that ranked quite highly in terms of development status and are used in other reporting purposes. So it was not too unexpected to see that parties had a high level of these reported at national level. The ones that were lowest in terms of the current awareness of a national institution were indicators to do with sort of 15.1, 18.2, and then sort of C.2. These are to do with sort of access monetary benefits derived from ABS systems or the disclosure of financial interest, and then the elimination of oh gosh, I've just 18.2, sorry, the name's completely eluded me for now. But the point is these indicators did have a low degree of parties reporting that they know a national institution. Now, it might be worth noting that it was interesting that some parties did have a lot of national institutions for indicators that do not have a method established. For example, 1.1 and 2.2, which to do with area under restoration and the proportion of area under biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. And when trying to delve into why that might be, it's predominantly because these indicators are to do with reducing threats and are often reported by ministries of environment. This is the perception of parties and who will be responsible for reporting on this. On the flip side, we see some indicators, for example, 12.1 and 7.1, which is to do with index of coastal eutrophication potential. These indicators do have established methodologies, but there are not many national institutions responsible. Now, when you delve into the methods of computation of these indicators, we find that, for example, 7.1 index of potential coastal eutrophication, global models are computed based on official data from national governments, but they are collected by UN organizations. So that might suggest why there are no national institutions responsible for reporting on them. When we look at the difference between, on the left, we have parties eligible to receive official development aid compared to parties that are not eligible. And we see the overall shape is quite similar. The same indicators, again, are mostly A3, 3.1, and 10.1 and 10.2. However, on average, the proportion of parties that responded yes to having a national institution is higher for parties that are not eligible to receive ODA, as opposed to those that are. Once we establish the idea of sort of what is the current availability of national institutions, for those parties that responded yes, we also wanted to know, well, is it compiled in a national database? Again, trying to sort of distill for indicators such as 7.1. And the options given were yes or no. What we find is the proportion of parties compiling each headline indicator in a national database varies. And across all headline indicators, an average of 39% of parties compile the indicators in a national database. More parties are able to compile headline indicators in a national database for those with an established methodology, in this case 45%, compared to the indicators without an established methodology, 34%. And it's, again, the usual suspects in terms of the number, frequency, and proportion of these indicators, 3.1, 10.1, 8.3, that are reported as quite high in terms of being currently reported. I would just like to highlight D3. That indicator does not have an established methodology, but came out as quite high in terms of being compiled in a national database. But I would just like to highlight that the number of responses is quite low. So that whilst the proportion is high in terms of the frequency, that is quite low. Then when we compare the headline indicators parties are most commonly compiling in a national database across ODA eligible parties and non-ODA eligible parties, we notice again, it's a similar pattern. However, the proportion of parties compiling the headline indicator in a national database is lower for ODA eligible parties compared to that of non-ODA eligible parties. Then we go back to sort of the first question. For parties that responded no or unknown to having a national institution with the responsibility of reporting on this indicator, they were subsequently asked, is the country able to produce the indicator at the national level in the short or medium term? The short term was constituted of 1 to 2 years, and this was to align with the reports to the CBD due in 2026, or in the medium term, so this was 3 to 5 years, to align with the submission of the 8 national reports due in 2029. Parties could also indicate the inability to produce the indicator in the short or medium term, and were requested to specify the reasons why, but they were also able to indicate whether or not the indicator is applicable to the party itself. What we see is that very few parties that currently do not have a national institution will be able to produce the indicators in the short term. The exception being some parties express the ability to produce indicators A1 and A2, as well as 2.2, and then towards the end, some of the indicators on 18.1 and 18.2 and 21.1. Most parties indicated that they will only be able to produce the indicators in the medium term. But there were several parties that suggested that they will be unable to produce the indicator in the short or medium term. This is sort of 25%. The reasons given include lack of an agreed up-to-date methodology, lack of available data, lack of human and technical capacity, lack of political will, or lack of financial support. Some headline indicators are considered not applicable by parties. There were some parties that indicated several indicators were not applicable. But if we focus on 9.2 and 7.1, these indicators were suggested by several parties as not being applicable. And that is index of coastal eutrophication. That is essentially landlocked countries are unable to currently produce this indicator. And then 9.2 is the percentage of the population in traditional occupations. If we then compare the average of indicators with the methodology compared to without, we notice that it's actually quite similar. Similar proportion of parties are able to produce headline indicators in the short term, as opposed for those indicators with a methodology, as opposed to those without a methodology. There isn't much variation amongst these. But then when we compare parties eligible to receive ODA compared to not, we notice that the portion of parties able to produce in the short term is actually similar. However, the indicators themselves are different. Parties eligible to receive ODA tended to suggest that they are more capable of reporting on indicators A1, A2, and 3.1 in the short term, and these are to do with reducing threats. In contrast, parties not eligible to receive ODA report that they're more able to produce the indicators to do with the tools and mainstreaming, for example, 21.1, 18.2, etc. And then, yes, once we've established that parties, when the framework in which they'll be able to produce the indicators, we asked those that said short-term, medium-term, or no others, or that it's not compiled in the indicator database, whether or not they require assistance for the production and compilation of the indicator, specifically at the national level. And once again, the answers were either yes or no. What we see is the proportion of parties requiring assistance for the production and compilation of headline indicators at the national level varies for each indicator. On average, 60% of parties are capable of producing and compiling all headline indicators. We see that parties require more support for headline indicators without an established methodology, on average 70%, compared to those that do have an established methodology, which is around 60%. And so this is the flip side of the previous questions, which were more dealing with the current capacity, and this is looking at the current capacity needs. And we see that it's lowest for those indicators 3.1, 10.1, and 10.2. The usual suspects have been aforementioned. And then obviously the ones that require the most capacity are those indicators that are not developed, C2, sort of non-monetary benefits of ABS, and then 18.1, 18.2, again, and to do with the financial the removal of perverse incentives. The headline indicators for which parties require assistance are similar among ODA eligible parties and non-ODA eligible parties. However, the proportion of parties that require assistance for the actual production and compilation of the indicator is consistently higher among ODA eligible parties, with a mean of 75%. This is in contrast to the non-ODA eligible parties with a mean of sort of 40%, suggesting that parties eligible to receive ODA require substantially more capacity to support. We then wanted to inquire, well, what was the type of capacity that these parties required to produce and compile the headline indicators at the national level? And to do this, parties were given 4 options. The top left graph indicates the data collection as a type of assistance. The top right graph is on training on the methodology for compiling the indicator at the national context. The graph on the bottom left is the assistance analyzing of the indicator. And finally, in the bottom right, the type of assistance is the institutional coordination on data reporting. The type of assistance that most frequently was reported by parties is training on the methodology for compiling the indicator at the national context, with an average of 95%. This is not all too surprising, given that from the IT targets, most of the indicators were calculated at the global level, whilst the monitoring framework and for the GBF is focusing more on the national capacity and national monitoring and support for this. Data collection was the second highest reported on average by parties as a type of capacity that's required. And then this was followed subsequently by assistance analyzing the indicator and the least parties required was institutional coordination on data reporting itself. Finally, we kind of mapped out which indicators need capacity and which indicators have current capacity. But now we need to know what is the sort of financial resources available to parties for the production and compilation of these indicators at the national level. Parties were able to provide 4 types of answers. This is the current financial resources are sufficient to produce the indicators. They're not quite sufficient to produce the indicators. They're far from sufficient, or they're not available at all. Most parties reported that they have insufficient financial resources to produce and compile the headline indicators at the national level, with an average of 34% across all indicators. 23% reported that financial resources were far from sufficient. Another 24% expressed that financial resources were not quite sufficient. And on average, only 19% of parties express having sufficient financial resources available for the production and compilation of the indicator. The proportion of parties with sufficient financial resources available to produce and compile indicators was on average smaller for indicators without an established methodology compared to those with an established methodology. It tended to be that the indicators without a methodology had less financial resources available than those that did. And then when we compare and contrast the financial resources available to ODA compared to non-ODA eligible parties, we see that there's a drastic difference in terms of proportion. On average, the proportion of parties with sufficient financial resources available to produce and compile the headline indicators is considerably smaller for ODA parties, with only 4% of parties across all indicators expressing the ability to have sufficient financial resources. This is compared to the 53% of parties that reported having sufficient financial resources. And then on average, yes, 39% of ODA eligible parties express having no financial resources, 25% having financial resources being far from sufficient, and 31% expressing they're not quite sufficient. Now, we'd like to know that despite many non-ODA eligible parties reporting that they do have sufficient financial resources, on average, 24% expressed having no financial resources available still. The remaining sort of 17% expressed financial resources are far from sufficient, and then the 7% expressed that financial resources are not quite sufficient. So what are some of the key findings of this sort of research? The first one is that there are headline indicators for which parties indicate there is sufficient national capacity. Overall, these indicators have an established methodology. They have an institution, a champion institution, which essentially has a mandate to develop, calculate the indicator based on collected data, and regularly update the indicator. Additionally, many of these indicators are aligned with Sustainable Development Goals and are therefore likely to have received support from capacity development initiatives. There are, however, many parties that indicated that capacity gaps in producing some of the headline indicators. This is particularly true for those indicators for which a methodology is in development and for which there are no established data collection mechanisms. Now, since the time of the survey, the outtake has produced guidance on the headline indicators. Despite this, several of them still require further work, and this is described in the SBSTA document for SBSTA 26 document 2. And then finally, yes, there is a need to mobilize resources from all sources to support parties and relevant organizations in the implementation of these national monitoring systems to be able to sort of fully produce and compile and thus monitor the implementation of the GBF successfully. And so with that, I come to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. A massive thank you to all the parties that responded to the questionnaire itself, and a thank you for the Secretariat for hosting this webinar today.
Thank you. So I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but please feel free to ask questions in the chat. But in terms of, first off, I would like to provide a little bit of additional background, and then I'm going to ask a question. So for those of you who don't recall, the headline indicators are part of the national reporting template. And so the first round of national reports will be due in February of 2026. And so at that point, by February of 2026 is when countries would be asked to report this data in their national reports. Obviously, they're also encouraged to use these indicators for planning purposes, but during that first round of national reporting is when there would be this effort to actually collect data. And so I'm going to ask, maybe this question is more for Natasha or for Roberto. How do you see that we can support countries? And I guess what work do you see happening to support countries so that by 2026, we may be in a different situation than we're in this survey? Thanks.
Sorry, I'll just display my things a bit wonky. I have no idea where I am. The first one, I guess,
take
the work of
this
the
slide
Arctic.
off if you want, then we can see you better.
Yes. There we go. There we go. I think the first step is actually, well, part of the work that has been done by the Arctic is to ensure that the indicators have the necessary guidance available for parties to report on. As I say, I think the indicators that are currently being produced are sort of three indicators that have been used previously in national reporting services. So I think there's a lot of sort of lessons learned that can be learned from what's been done in these indicators, and sort of having institutions that can provide that guidance for producing and compiling that indicator. I think that's sort of the first step, and then identifying, I guess, which parties sort of are lacking that capacity. As I say, it's particularly the analyzing the data that seems to be the one that most reported by parties. So I think that's the shift from going from the 80 targets to the current GBF model. I think sort of trying to address that is sort of and making sure that parties have the option to use their own data that can be aggregated to that global scale for the online reporting purposes will be pivotal in that regard.
If I may add, Gillian, just a couple of the initiatives that might be helpful for parties to be aware of. So as you know, the GEF Early Action Support Project aims to help countries with establishing national monitoring systems. And indeed, there's some guidance that's available in draft form, which helps countries with identifying their national needs following the survey that Roberto's just presented, and then to identify the activities that will need capacity support, so support around the sort of compilation of data that's related to that, and then indeed where the financial resources might need to be mobilised. And in addition to that, there's a number of different other initiatives in play that could help countries with, firstly, identifying what are the capacity gaps in terms of compiling these indicators, and secondly, what are the resourcing gaps. And then, as Roberto describes, there's probably some technical work to be done, mobilising those organisations that are involved in generating the metadata. So those members of the RTEG that were involved in generating that metadata, we mobilised to provide some further background information on exactly how to compile the indicators following the metadata that's now available online, and that could be interpreted at the national level, subject to national needs. So yeah, various initiatives and work going on that could be able to support these capacity gaps that we've identified today. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, obviously we at the Secretariat are also working to support this. And if you look in the SAPSTA 26/2 document, even before we had the results of the survey, when the ATEG was discussing this, there is a strong call for support for implementation of the monitoring framework from the different organizations that have been involved in developing these indicators, also from donors and from the GEF. And so I do want to highlight to those of you who are listening that in order for this monitoring framework to be a success, it will require an investment and a focus on building national capacity. However, it will also make the implementation of the framework have a much higher chance of success. And so I think it would be it's an investment that would be well spent. I see that James Williams, who's the co-chair of the ATEG, has also raised his hand. I'll hand over to you, James.
Thank you very much indeed, Gillian, and thank you to Roberto for presenting the results of that himself and colleagues have taking part in bringing together, and thank you to parties who responded. Very helpful to have that view. A little bit of a comment and a little bit of a question, if I can, please, Roberto. I mean, I think firstly, to follow up what Gillian was just saying, I think that there is going to be a lot of work needed to be able to implement the monitoring framework by all parties, and I think that's both developed and developing countries. And I would urge parties to do that, because I think that it is really important in terms of being able to see how the ambition within the framework is actually translated into action on the ground and results and outcome. And I think it's important that we look at both outcomes and processes, and that's part of the reason why we've got both the headline and the binary indicators. So that's all very positive. Roberto, a question for you, if I can, please. In terms of the results that we've got here, clearly you said at the start that this is a small sample in terms of the total number of parties who might be able to respond in due course. Are you planning on redoing the survey at some point? Because obviously, as you said, at the point that the survey was done, the work that was going on the metadata was in train, so parties didn't have all of the information that they now have in, for example, INF 14. Where the metadata for all of the indicators is now provided.
Ideally, the survey is sort of set up. The timing of it, I guess, would have to be considered, but it would be beneficial to be able to track and hopefully notice a sort of shift in the capacity going more from sort of unable to sort of being able to produce it. So the intention of sort of time and resources allowing it, then yes, to sort of carry on reporting the capacity needs, preferably before 2026. I guess 2026 will be the ultimate determinant of the capacity of parties to report on that, as we'll see what they're able to do in that sense. But as I say, there's still time within that that sort of resources and sort of organizations, parties can allocate sort of efforts to hopefully by then have less of sort of no capacity and financial resources to actually be able to report and produce by 2026.
Thank you. And I see Natasha has popped up. So Natasha, you probably want to comment on my potentially putting words in your mouth in terms of the work to do.
No, not at all. I think it's a really good idea. And so I think our intention, we're working with the Secretariat, is to leave this survey open, and it helps us, as Gillian's pointed out, you know, there's various initiatives in play by different organisations to mobilise the support that might be required to operationalise the monitoring framework. So our intention is to keep that survey open and to be able to provide some sort of context for the capacity support that these agencies might be doing. So we'll be able to keep a list of, or keep a kind of a background tracking document of where the countries that are requiring support, and also the areas that are needing more support, and that can help frame the activities that are going on between the Secretariat and all of the different organisations that are providing support.
Excellent.
So we keep it open, basically, and we'll put a link in the documents and probably in the chat here as to if there are other organisations or sorry, if other parties would like to complete the survey. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know if anyone else has additional questions. I mean, we maybe are going to wrap up very quickly today, but obviously these are online, and so people can feel free to listen in later. So maybe if there's not additional questions, I would suggest, if Roberto, if you have any last words, and then I think we can close the webinar.
No, well, I think most points have been covered again. Thank you all for sort of joining us today. And if there are any sort of questions, I noticed someone was asking when the results will be made available. But subsequently that, if there are any further queries, do not hesitate to reach out to me in any way, shape or form. But thank you again.
Yes, the results will be available in a document called Information Document 19 on the SAPSTA website. We are hoping to get this online very shortly. As I also mentioned, and I think Roberto mentioned, the survey only just ended this month, so it's very fresh results, and so we will be getting this online for you as soon as we can. So, okay, well, thank you so much for the presentation and for all of the work, both Natasha and Roberto, and I know you have support from Matea, who I saw is also online, so thank you all. Bye.